the whole thing, Ian, about foreign affairs and the American Civil War is amazing and almost completely understudied. It's really something that needs to be studied a lot more. And I will see who's that. There's somebody needs to mute because it's making funny noises. Is it me? Is it you, Brennan? Okay, never mind. I just muted you. I was in a meeting yesterday about it was just awful because one person who was 900 years old didn't know what they were doing, and okay, sorry, I just found a podcast, possibly. Okay, I can't promise that. Well, anyway, so I will work on that, Ian, and put it up as a possibility. So where was I? And sorry, what?
I just said sounds good.
Okay. Damn it. This thing I just found out about is really throwing me for a loop. Anyway, let me start talking about Civil War, because one of the problems with I think the recorded lectures is that they're great because I can throw in pictures and stuff, but one of the problems is that it tend not to think about the big broad issues. And I think the most important thing, well, not the most important thing, the most important thing is slavery and the ending of slavery. But really, the two things I like to highlight in the Civil War are, first, the modernity of it, which is a shocking and very massive change between, say, the Mexican War and the Civil War, between European wars and European rebellions in 1848 and the American Civil War. And under that includes the terrible effects that it had on soldiers and on injuries and on casualties and on survivability of battles. And like all wars, the Civil War, the technology and the battlefield tactics and the killing part of the Civil War, it is always outstrips the medical advances at the time. So it's one of these ironies in world history that medicine often goes through significant leaps of progress because it's required to, because of casualties and weird things, but terrible things happening during war. And the industrialization of war makes all that worse. So you have exploding shells that are causing infinitely more damage than anything that could have happened in the War of 1812 or even the Mexican War or things like that. So this is a major thing that we tend to forget about because there's so much emphasis on the romanticism of the Civil War, romanticizing the Civil War, the heroism, the gallantry of the Old South and all that stuff that we now know to be completely made up in the 1880s and 1890s. But we talk so much about that, we don't talk about technology and about the actual mechanics of warfare and tactics, right? So that's one of the huge elephants in the room. And the second elephant in the room is what I just mentioned, which is sentimentality and romanticism. I can't possibly count the number of Civil War fans that follow me on Twitter, or that I follow on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. It's just astounding. And you don't have, in my view, you don't have World War II fans or World War I fans, in theory, of the same kind that you have Civil War fans. People, I mean, you even see this until very recently. People were having plantation weddings in the South in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and early 2000s, and there was people dressing up the whole bride, the groom's side of the family, the groomsmen and all that crap. They were all Confederate soldiers. I mean, just all this junk, big hoop skirts, and Gone with the Wind mania, and excessive concentration on the letters that people wrote to their sweethearts, and everything like that. And Ken Burns' multi-part documentary, which of course came out 20 years before you were born, was particularly bad in this regard, over romanticizing the war. And that in the view of professional historians has really gotten in the way of us trying to understand what actually happened, and how ideology especially pushed the coming of the Civil War, but also pushed the war and then Reconstruction to its conclusion, and Reconstruction ultimately to its ultimate failure. So on the one hand, that's why I say these two big themes are opposite. There's technology on the one hand, and there's romanticism on the other hand, and they're both understudied. I mean, there may not be understudied by academic historians who overstudy everything, but certainly understudied in the popular mind. There's nothing romantic about the Civil War. There's nothing. I mean, there's a great deal of heroism. There's a great deal of morality to be admired in the people who are fighting to end slavery and human bondage and things like that. But the actual war itself, is just vicious, as they all are. But again, this technology thing, which is what I want to start with, makes the American Civil War especially brutal. Okay, so why are these? Someone's coming in from the outside here. Why are these? Why is this the first modern war? Well, you have a number of developments because of effectively the Industrial Revolution developing steel to a greater degree than ever before. Okay, so railroads, for instance, are enormously important in the Civil War, and they're being built across the country at a fever pace. Okay? More so in the North than the South. I'll get to that in a minute. The second thing is another kind of thing that's often forgot about because everyone wants to talk about in Antietam and Gettysburg and the land battles, is the ironclad ships are a new thing-ish in the Civil War. And this is extremely important because, is this recording? Because they prove to be not only more superior than wooden ships, they revolutionize naval warfare and allow for things along with new cannons and things like shore bombardment and bombarding of harbors that was much more devastating than ever before. And the final major thing under industrialization, modernization is the invention of the rifle. Now, you may think, well, people have had rifles forever. People use rifles in the American Revolutionary War. Well, not really. They used muskets. And for any of you who are either in the military or hunt or know a lot about firearms, a rifle is a long gun that has a rifled barrel. There's grooves in the barrel in a screw-like fashion that get the bullet spinning and makes a sort of burrow through the air. And that not only are they more powerful because of the better gunpowder and things like that they use, but they're infinitely more accurate. There was a time when muskets, were they were effective up until a certain point, maybe 70 yards away, maybe something more than 70 yards away. But a rifle, even a Civil War rifle, could be used to accurately shoot something 600 yards away. 600 football field, 6 football fields. Okay, so this is an enormous difference between the previous wars and the Civil War, and it's one of the reasons why you're able to have such long pitched battles where the sides are at such a great distance from each other. Now, eventually, riflemen can't reload fast enough, or run out of ammunition too quickly. So there are cavalry charges, and there are even bayonet, not bayonet, sword. What are they called? There's hand-to-hand combat as well, but it's preceded by this long-range stuff with rifles and with cannon. Okay, and then of course, then it just takes off from there. Technology takes the Franco-Prussian War is absolutely brutal. World War I is even more brutal because they become even better at the industrialization of war, and then it just the atomic age is sort of the if you will icing on the cake of the destructive power of technology. So again, that's fundamentally different, and this is one of the reasons why there's a big difference between the combatants. The North, the Union, the United States Army had all sorts of advantages: manufacturing, railroad mileage, money, more officers, more of a larger army, all kinds of things that may give it a sort of automatic leg up on the Confederacy. On the other hand, in order to defeat the Confederacy, the Union would have to conquer an area larger than modern Western Europe. So you have, granted, even though I just went on this long screed about how marvelous technology was at the time, they have to use Civil War technology to do what armies and artillery battalions and tanks had to do in World War II in terms of covering a significant amount of land and conquering it. So although this is a big advantage, the South sort of had an advantage on its side because of the size of the territory. It's often said, and I think this is probably true, that Confederates had the advantage of being highly motivated. Okay, secession to them was a new declaration of independence. Secession to them was fighting off the oppressor. Secession to them was founding their new nation, and they have that sort of fiery blood thing going that Northern soldiers don't have until after the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, the Union Army, which historians increasingly, by the way, are referring to it as the U.S. Army, because that's what it was. But at the time, people said Union Army, so we go back and forth. They were fighting to preserve the Republic, but that's a little bit too vague of an idea. That's a little bit too intellectual of an idea. Once it becomes to fight to make men free, right, as the sort of founding motto of the Republican Party was, then the emotionalism and the gallantry and the romanticism of fighting for the Union comes to the fore. But that's not until 1862-63. So it's a major difference. Okay, both sides felt very patriotic, but they felt very patriotic to their section of the country. Okay, one of the problems is for both sides is that recruits were not ready for modern warfare on either side. It was just, there were state militias and things like that, but they hadn't really done anything in forever. A lot of them had never fired a rifle, for instance, had fired various types of long guns, but rifles were kind of new. One historian has estimated that the Army of the Potomac, the main part of the Union Army, had only been had only spent 30 days fighting in the first 2 years of the war. So there's a whole sort of, this is a terrible way to characterize it, but it's kind of true. There's a whole sort of learning curve that the soldiers and the officers especially have to come up with, have to go through in order to actually fight the war. Okay, so that's why 61, 62, and even parts of 63 are so dicey. Things could have gone one way or the other. Now there are similarities. Sorry. While I'm doing this about technology and modern warfare, feeding and supplying the army is something also we overlook completely. The scope of the war completely overwhelmed the United States and the Confederacy over about how to do this sort of, the basics, the feeding and supplying and things like that, right? So in all of these ways, the modernness of the war is both a benefit to the Union in a way, but also a problem for both sides. Now, I also want to say about both sides, heavy propaganda, right? Vast propaganda to mobilize public opinion. Newspapers, of course, at this time were really churning out tons of editions. The steam-powered printing press and all that stuff we talked about were very important. Soldiers, in a very romantic way, were going in before they went off to war. They would go into a photographic studio, usually in the city or town where they had mustered, and had formal portraits taken. You see a lot of these if you're a Civil War fan, and if you browse the internet, people go to have these little portraits taken. They're called carte visite. This is the French word for visiting card, but in this case, it means a little picture of yourself. And you'd get these things and have them printed, and you'd send one home to your blessed mother or your sweetheart or whoever, your family. Here I am off to the war. Remember, I'll have this picture to remember you while I'm gone. Okay. And that was for most people in the country the first time they've ever had a photograph of a member of their family. So that's a big thing. The Civil War in America turns photography into big business as well as art. Okay, so I can't. They're just before this. There aren't any other wars that have so many drastic changes in them in American history up until that point. Okay, so let me then talk now about some other basic things. Military strategy. Okay, obviously, and perhaps rightly, the Confederacy adopted a defensive strategy. The Confederacy, in the very beginning, knows that it cannot go up, invade the North. It cannot capture. Well, it tries to capture Washington, but they realize pretty soon that they can't do it. But they also realize that in order to win the war, the North has to come down and defeat the South. If the Confederacy is sort of a runaway region, we're leaving by, like a runaway child. You have to go get them. You can't just say, well, runaway kids always return home, but anyway, or not always return home, but some do. You have to go back. You have to go out and reconquer the territory. So the sooner the South figures out, the better that is for them, and they use a defensive offensive strategy. Okay, so almost all of the North's manpower and technology advantages in the first 2 years of the war are countered by the fact that the South has this geographic strategic advantage of, you got to come conquer us. There's a big difference between that and other types of warfare. Okay, now, first years of the war. The war begins in the East. Most of the war's fighting, as you'll see on a map I give in the recorded lecture, it takes place in a narrow corridor between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia, relatively small piece of land. The first battle of Bull Run is a loss for the U.S., a loss for the Union Army. It's a Confederate victory, but it was the first battle, and yeah, because it was the first battle, it was the first battle where you had these massive casualties, massive problems, and the romanticism for the war starts to fade almost immediately after Bull Run. Okay, people are like, oh, wait a minute now. Okay, now that we actually have to have our sons die, and soldiers writing home about how they're seeing bodies completely mangled and blown apart by cannons and things like that. This is quite different. Now, it doesn't kill off the romanticism, and it doesn't kill off the propaganda, and it doesn't kill off the patriotism in the war totally, but it's a major shock. Okay, and so what then has to happen is the Union gets a new commander, General George McClellan. Okay, assumes command of the Army of the Potomac. Okay, now what happens is, initially, Robert E. Lee is able to blunt McClellan's attacks in Virginia and force him to do a defensive position to protect Washington, D.C. If the Confederacy had captured Washington, D.C. in 61 or even 62, it would have been over right then. So once Lee had sort of stopped McClellan in Virginia by 62, Lee was able to then turn and do an invasion of the North. Now, not do an invasion of the North sounds like a cooking recipe. Invade the North. When we say that, invade the North, what we really mean is he's invading Maryland. He's invading a border state. Don't really invade the North until Gettysburg. And loses a battle at sort of a draw, but Lee was defeated, or at the very least stopped, at the Battle of Antietam by McClellan. Okay, and the Battle of Antietam, we forget about this, we overlook this because Gettysburg is so better known and observed and celebrated in the Gettysburg Address and all that stuff. The Antietam is the worst day in American history up until this point. Sorry, I just lost my notes there for a second. Oh, great. It's the bloodiest day in American history, right? The numbers, my notes just I clicked. See, I'm having trouble with the computer today. I clicked on the close box, and I'm losing my stats. Bloodiest day in American history, and again, another sort of crushing blow to the idea that this is going to be a romantic war. And also, what I've forgotten to mention in the beginning of this thing, another belief that on both sides that the war is going to be quick. Confederacy is going to be able to capture Washington really quickly, they believed, and the Union believes that the Confederacy is just a bunch of ragtag rednecks, and we're going to, they don't really know how to fight. We're going to defeat them. I mean, neither of those two things obviously happen. So September 17th, 1862, the Battle of Antietam is a terrible blow. And what McClellan fails to do is then he fails to go and chase and destroy Lee's army, right? Which he probably could have done after the Battle of Antietam while Lee was retreating. Now, this is, if you ever run into a Civil War fan at a bar, if you want to be bored out of your mind, ask that person, should McClellan have overrun Lee's army? McClellan's argument is that he's out of supplies. He didn't want to get overextended, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Other people argued that McClellan wasn't much of a fighting man. He was sort of an organizational man and didn't actually want to get into Virginia and try to finish the job off. So, and this is a standard problem in military history, and all the way up to including World War II, especially. Hitler and indeed Rommel have to give what are known as halt orders after the invasion of France and before the evacuation of Dunkirk that prevent the Nazis from overwhelming and completely defeating the British Expeditionary Force and effectively winning the war right then. And people are all saying, you know, why did they do that? Why did they stop? Why didn't they just keep going all the way to Dunkirk and kill everybody? Well, the argument was that our tanks. So I'm just going to World War II for a minute here. Our tanks need to repair. Our machinery needs to be repaired. We're outrunning our supply lines. What we don't want to do is go all the way to Dunkirk with a token force and then get swamped by the French and the British and get defeated that way. So there's always a debate in military history, and indeed, presumably in military tactics, the strategy school and things like that. How far do you go? How often do you risk outrunning your supply lines? Well, McClellan didn't want to risk it one single iota, so he doesn't do anything. This pisses off Lincoln tremendously. Lincoln fires him, replaces him with Ambrose Burnside, right, who then attacks the Confederacy at Fredericksburg in Virginia and loses disastrously. So really, for the U.S. Army, 61 and 62 in the East are terrible. You know, it really is shocking that they just can't swat away this little fly. But however, the Union has some bright spots, bright things on its side, and that is that the war in the West, which now we consider the Midwest, was going quite well for the Union. Ulysses S. Grant was the general out west. Okay, he wins significant victory, captures Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee, and then he's able to withstand and repel the Confederate attack at the Battle of Shiloh. Okay, so it looks as if the West, sort of ironically, since all the sort of attention is being focused on the East, is going to be the savior of the United States. And that's another sort of fitting thing, because after all, what did we say all of last week? The West is what the whole damn thing is about. It's all about slavery and moving slavery to the West. So the fact that the West is being the Western theater, if you will, is being won by the U.S. Army. This is a huge boost to the idea that eventually the American government will win the war. Okay, now at this stage, we have to remember that slavery is obviously the cause of the war. We could, I can go to reams and reams of details about that. In fact, the podcast I put up about the cause of the Civil War explains why that's undeniably true in every single way. But remember, in the early days of the war, Lincoln and the North and the Union and the U.S. government is constantly pushing the line. This is 61, 62, that we're here to preserve the Union. Okay, they know, Lincoln knows, all the people in the government know, all the major military people in the American Army know that it's about slavery, but Lincoln's afraid, and quite rightly, and the cabinet's afraid, quite rightly, that if they bang on too much about slavery, if they turn slavery into a sort of rhetorical weapon about the war, the border states are going to get pissed off and leave. Okay, remember, there's always this kind of dicey situation where Missouri, from west to east, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware are all, pardon me, slave states, but they're all Union states. They remain loyal to the Union. And particularly in Missouri, this is touch and go in Missouri. One of the podcasts I'll put up is very interesting. It's about Jesse James and the Civil War. And one of the things that the historian I interview in that podcast, the argument he makes is, we always talk about this brother fighting against brother stuff in the Civil War, and it's all, I was going to say BS, but it's all fiction, except in Missouri, because it's actually true. The really towns or families are split towns are so the border states need to be kept in line in the union. The other thing is that Kentucky especially needs to be kept in the union because well, this is somewhat debatable, and I'll explain that in a second, because of the Ohio River. If Lincoln is able to maintain control of both sides of the Ohio River, both banks, right, then he has ability to ship things way out west to Grant. Very, very important. Now, I always make a big deal of this in class, and it's true. But lately, I've been coming to sort of back off a little bit on the severity in which I make this argument about the Ohio River, because I found from real experts about this sort of geostrategy in the Civil War that the Confederacy, certainly in Tennessee and Kentucky, didn't have. Remember, there are Confederate troops in Kentucky, in southern Kentucky, southwestern Kentucky, especially. They didn't have the manpower to march north and capture Louisville, and they couldn't have controlled the Ohio River anyway. Probably couldn't have. So it's kind of a moot point that the Ohio River is essential to Lincoln, but it is a nice thing to have. For Lincoln to have. He has a sort of like, well, okay, this is going to work because I can always be feeding and supplying Western troops without being sniped at from the banks from the Kentucky side of the Ohio River. But the other thing is also morale and money. If Maryland goes over to the Confederacy, Washington, D.C. is cut off, right? All of a sudden, the Maryland militia is now a Confederate part of the Confederate Army, and it's covering the northern flank of Washington, D.C., and for the southern flank is covered by Virginia. So Washington, D.C. is totally screwed in terms of positioning and strategy. So Maryland perhaps is even more important than Kentucky. And Delaware is also important, even though it's this tiny state. People don't really think about it very much. It's not important because it's now the leading financial and credit card state in the union. There are very lax laws about what you can do to set up a financial corporation in Delaware. So all your credit cards and all your banking stuff ultimately goes to Delaware. Anyway, that wasn't the case then, but Delaware had very, very important ports. And if the English or the French ever decided to get in on the side of the South, that would have been a disaster. Okay, so don't forget the border states. They're not just something to overlook. Okay, so the reason went on so long about that, I'm sorry that this is now proving to be an almost infinitely long lecture, is that slavery continues to be the issue. Lincoln can't go any further with slavery because at 61, 62, because he has to keep the border states. Okay, so that he's constantly talking about preserving the Union, In the early days of the war, Congress adopts a resolution saying that the Union had no intention of ever interfering with slavery. Again, it's sort of just a PR exercise. But as 1861 came to a close, the change that happens is that the military, the U.S. Army, starts to treat emancipated blacks, emancipated African Americans, emancipated slaves who are either being captured, right, especially in the West by Grant, or running away to Union lines. They're keeping them as contraband. Okay, contraband in war is property of military value that is subject to confiscation. So the American Army is confiscating these people because these people were the property of the South, in the same way that it would confiscate a farm in the South because it could then use the crops on that farm. And so what happens is eventually a lot of these African Americans, especially men, men join the U.S. Army and women join the nursing corps and all kinds of stuff. Okay, so it then becomes more about what African Americans in late '61, early '62 uh, uh, calling it the Freedom War. Okay, this again is a major Civil War. So much about propaganda and songs and the Battle Hymn of the Republic and I talk about all this romanticizing stuff isn't actually true what happens on the ground, but it is actually true that the propaganda is out there and that it matters. So what starts to happen is through late 61, 62, there is this idea in the North that we can defeat the Confederacy more easily by defeating slavery. We obviously can't defeat them by invading Virginia. Tried that a couple of times. Didn't work, even though McClellan could be largely blamed for the failure to follow up. But what that did, of course, was gave Lee time to regroup and resupply. So Lincoln is now starting to think, emancipation here is now a possible thing I could use as a war measure. Okay, this is aided by the fact that in August, now this is early on, August 1861, John Fremont issues, he's a general, U.S. general, issues a proclamation freeing the slaves in Missouri in 1861. Now that's a big deal, right? And again, Lincoln is afraid of this, and so he rescinds it because he's afraid that Missouri's going to go over to the Confederacy, or the other states will go over to the Confederacy. So he rescinds it pretty quickly, but the idea is there. And the important thing here is that the idea for emancipation comes to the higher levels of the administration as a military necessity. Fremont uses as a military necessity in Missouri, even though that order is rescinded. It sort of shows Lincoln and the cabinet that emancipation can be used as a war tool. So by the summer of '62, Lincoln starts to believe that emancipation to become a political and military necessity. Okay, what he wants to do is, well, he wants to sort of announce emancipation right away. William Seward, the Secretary of State, says to him, well, wait a minute, if we do that, and then we keep losing battles in the East. Remember, battles in the East are getting more attention than battles in the South, in the West. So even though it's sort of 50-50, it looks like the American army is losing. Anyway, once Antietam is won, right? That's so Seward says we need to wait for a victory or something that can be spun as a victory before we announce emancipation. Well, Antietam did that. Antietam was good enough. Right. So after 5 days after Antietam, September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Okay. Then January 1st, he signs the Emancipation Proclamation, the official ones. Okay. Now, important to remember here, the Emancipation Proclamation's effects, the purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation, the nature of the Emancipation Proclamation, the scope of the Emancipation Proclamation have been exaggerated almost beyond belief ever since 1863, even in 1963. When President Kennedy goes on TV to talk about his desire for a civil rights bill after some real racist outrages in Alabama, says that African Americans had been free for 100 years. President Lincoln freed the slaves in 1863, and it's been 100. Well, because everyone latches on to that January 1st, 1863 emancipation. But it's like Juneteenth. People latch onto that as the end of slavery. Well, it wasn't really, but we can quibble about that until the cows come home. Anyway. What the Emancipation Proclamation actually says is it declares that slaves in Confederate-held territory are free. Okay, so what that means is that as far as the federal government is concerned, all slaves in the Confederacy are now free. Now, that doesn't that doesn't have the immediate effect that you might think it does, because of course the Confederacy controls the Confederacy. The slaves just can't suddenly become, say, adios. I'm going to set up my own farm or set up my own shop or anything like that. So it is largely a symbolic thing. Okay. Now it's not a symbolic thing in the West, where of course the Union is able to capture those former slaves, and once they're then captured as contraband, and then the Emancipation Proclamation sets them free. That is a significant number of people. So don't get me wrong. I don't want to downplay the importance of the Emancipation Proclamation, but I don't want to say the Emancipation Proclamation solves everything, because it certainly doesn't. After all, ironically, the places the Emancipation Proclamation, doesn't apply are the border states: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, Union states. Okay, so it's like Lincoln leapfrogs over the border states to say that slaves in the Confederacy are emancipated, but slaves in the border states aren't. Now, however, we can start talking about the North being able to turn the ideological basis of the war in its favor. Okay. So now it becomes about a war about freedom, a war about liberating the slaves. And this takes off tremendously. You have all kinds of things. Julia Ward Howe writes the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Probably, I mean, we could fight to the death over this if you ever want to meet me in a bar somewhere. Probably the greatest American song ever written, all things considered. Just unbelievable. So important, by the way, that Winston Churchill asked that it be the hymn played at the end of his funeral as the procession of people were leaving St. Paul's Cathedral. They played the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Anyway, it's a poem first by Julia Ward Howe, and then it's adapted to the music from John Brown's Body. So that's a very big deal. The fact that Black troops are being able to be enlisted was a very big deal. Okay, the American Army had not done this originally because they feared that white soldiers wouldn't fight alongside Blacks, and of course the border states would be alienated. But by 1863, the fact that the border states are still unconquered by the Confederacy, and it becomes obvious to the Union and to Lincoln and everybody in Washington that the Confederacy in no way can capture the border states, then they start to ignore that problem. Right? We don't give a rat's ass if Kentuckians get upset over the abolition of slavery, or more importantly, get upset that there are now Black men in the American Army fighting in the South. So by the end of the war, 180,000 Black men served in the American Army and 24,000 in the American Navy. Okay, most of them were Black soldiers. Most of the Black soldiers were emancipated slaves who had joined the Army in the South. From what we can tell, now this is impossible. This is not impossible. Very hard to determine, because it's very hard to determine people's emotional reaction to things. We can only do it through letters and through the Black press in the North and things like that. But as far as we can tell, serving in the military for African Americans was really a liberating experience. A lot of them use the military to not only become more educated, but to gain leadership skills and things like that, organizational skills. They then use that after the Civil War to serve in political office, and all that kind of thing. It turns out that in the Navy, white sailors and Black sailors were treated more or less the same. So African Americans find this tremendously liberating. We always forget about the Navy, but it is immensely popular among African Americans. Now, but Black soldiers in the Army do not receive equal treatment. They are usually in segregated regiments, and that, by the way, lasts until World War II, well, until the end of World War II. So it's a we don't want to have a Hosanna moment that everything becomes sort of racially wonderful after emancipation and after the enlistment of African Americans. But however, almost in exactly the same way that the addition of American troops helps the Allied side push itself over into victory in World War I, the addition of Black soldiers, first of all, there are enough of them, and the fact that the war now has this kind of civilizing, moralistic mission is crucial for winning the war, right? This also had a big effect on Lincoln. Okay, Lincoln insisted. This is getting into the weeds of military technology, not technology, strategy, military, what do they call it? The etiquette of war and stuff like that. Lincoln started to insist that when African Americans, Black soldiers in the U.S. Army were captured by the Confederacy, they had to be treated the same as white POWs. Okay. Now, this obviously didn't happen very often, but he made that a definite policy thing. And then when there were prisoner exchanges later in the war, Lincoln insisted that African Americans be part of that. Okay, would have been very easy for the Confederacy and very easy for the Union not to go that far and say, okay, we have a prisoner exchange, and then the southern states will say, yeah, but we're going to keep the Blacks because they were ours to begin with, and you stole them from us. And he said, no. The American soldiers, you are foreign, you are rebels against the United States. They have to be part of prisoner exchanges. So this is one of the things in which we see Lincoln's thinking and Lincoln's attitude towards slavery and towards the future of slavery, towards the future of the war, really modifies a lot all throughout the war. But it is very, very impressive how Lincoln is able to not only stay on top of sort of the moral trajectory of the war, if you will, but is able then to use it for the advantage of the Union. Okay, and it's my belief, although you can never prove this because it's conjecture at best, is that if Lincoln had not been shot and had lived to serve his presidency, serve out the second term of his presidency. By the way, Lincoln could have gone on to a third term. There was no abolition against that back then. He would have handled Reconstruction in the same way. He initially had a very, very, very light-handed approach to what he wanted to happen to the South after the Civil War, right? Liberality all around, no reprisals, none of this, none of that. Well, again, don't write this in your essays or anything because it's ahistorical in many ways. But I like to think of this sort of historical game because we already see how Lincoln has changed his mind, changed his policy, changed his approach towards slavery as the conditions of the war required, and it's quite possible, in my view, very likely he would have changed his mind, his policy, and his actions toward Reconstruction as the conditions of Reconstruction required. So I think among many, many, many other things, that's perhaps the most devastating thing about Lincoln's death, is that Reconstruction might have been different. Okay, now I have a whole big sections here on finance, on the question how the question of liberty develops, the West and more about the West, some about war and American religion, but I really need to move on because I've talked too much about ideology and technology. So I want to talk about now. I want to talk more about the actual war and get it over with, so to speak. Remember, that Lee, we're talking about 63. Okay. Lee had tried to invade the North or invade the border states of Virginia, former state of Virginia, and been rebuffed at Antietam. On the other hand, that this did give him room to regroup, and so he attacks Gettysburg in July of 1863. Okay. And this, I suppose, some of you may know this. Students are always better at military history than I am, but this may have been the biggest battle of the war in terms of casualties. It probably is. Maybe, maybe I guess Antietam is probably worse. It's certainly the biggest battle of the war as being kind of the ultimate turning point, because of course Lee is going north as sort of a salient, if you will, try to capture those, penetrating and getting at Gettysburg. And people, if you've ever been to Gettysburg, it's the tiniest town in the world. People say, what the hell's going on in Gettysburg? It's very much a transportation crossroads. It's a huge, if Gettysburg, then you can move on to Harrisburg and all kinds of stuff it would have been, and then eventually Philadelphia. It really would have been a tremendous victory for the Confederacy. But of course, as you know, the 3 days of fighting, General Meade is a genius in Gettysburg, even though at a lot of times it was very touch and go. The famous Pickett's Charge fails, Lee's greatest blunder, I suppose. The American Army wins the Battle of Gettysburg in July, and it's a major victory. It's perhaps the major victory, along with, and don't forget this, along with Grant's victory at Vicksburg in Virginia in the same month. Okay, this is a 1-2 blow that is militarily very impressive. But sort of psychologically, sort of war morale, sort of boosting war support in the North is just huge. Okay, money pours in. War bonds are sold almost as fast as they could print them. Lincoln is very, very impressed with Grant. He's more impressed with Grant than he is with Meade, and so he takes, because Grant is very active. Because Grant is very he pushes, right, as Lincoln famously said. This is a quote that's always overwrought. He fights, right? Meade fought too, but Meade was sort of a half of McClellan, half of Grant. He's a strategist and a mobilizing guy, and Grant would just fight no matter what. He's a guy who would outstrip his supply lines if he felt he had to. Okay, so anyway, so Grant takes charge of the armies and begins a war of attrition against Lee's army in Virginia. Okay, this is 1864. 6 weeks of fighting. Grant had 60,000 casualties, and Lee had 30,000. Okay, this is incredible. You would think that means that Grant is losing, but actually no, Grant is winning. Grant has a lot more men at his disposal, and Grant is willing to, at least for the time being, willing to lose twice as many men. That's casualties, not killed in action, by the way. Twice as many men as Lee in order to win the ultimate victory. Okay, he begins a siege of Lee at Petersburg, Virginia, and by this time, one of the things about the West, okay, Grant's able to secure things in the West, and Sherman is able to go into the Southeast because of the West. So Virginia becomes this kind of isolated pocket because Sherman enters Atlanta, which is the biggest railroad hub in the South. Captures Atlanta, so the Confederacy is increasingly shrinking. These victories in 1863, plus the continued victories, as awful as they are, as almost Pyrrhic as they are, are a big boost to Lincoln. Lincoln's going to lose the 1864 election. He is going to lose. He believes he's going to lose. We should do a podcast just on that election. It's absolutely fascinating. But he wins. McClellan, by the way, is a Democratic candidate, runs against him. He wins the election in 64. And this sort of seals the fate of the Confederacy because Grant is relentless. Sherman is relentless. Sherman's so relentless that by the time he gets to the South, he just sort of doesn't leave. Sorry, my email is binging and I don't want it to do that. So to make a long story short, November, December 64, Sherman goes from Atlanta to the sea coast and then heads into South Carolina. Remember, South Carolina had been the SS, the sort of uber Confederate of all the Confederate states, the most not only the worst conditions for slavery, the most viciously racist, and the most strongly in favor of secession. Lincoln was able to get 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, January 31st, 1865. Then on the 3rd, of course, of April, Grant takes Richmond. Lee surrenders to Grant on April 9th at a town called Appomattox Courthouse. He doesn't surrender in a building called the Appomattox Courthouse. Believe it or not, the name of the town is the Appomattox Courthouse. Okay, and it's April 9th. And Lincoln has, now, by the way, again, this is kind of nitpicky and kind of pedantic, but that doesn't mean necessarily the war is over, right? There are still problems in the West that have to be cleaned up. There's still so Lee's surrender is the surrender of the major Confederate army to the Union and is more or less the end, but it is not actually the end. Sherman still has work to do, but Lincoln, Lee surrender is on April 9th. Lincoln only has 5 days to enjoy this because, of course, he's shot on April 14th, died the next morning. And the nation just gets plunged into this unbelievable mourning, the North anyway. And as awful as this sounds, it was one of these things that actually increased Northern support for the war. They're already supporting the war. Northern belief in the moral superiority of the North and the moral superiority of the mission of the North in winning the Civil War. Okay, so Lincoln becomes a martyr. African Americans venerate him, right? And it just gives that little extra bit of justification for the cost and the brutal cost of the war. So that's where I want to get back to this whole idea of romanticism and ideology, because although at the beginning I was trashing romanticism and all that stuff because you end up with crap like Gone with the Wind and movies like that, which are just, literally fiction. All movies are fiction, but I mean, these are really bad fiction, and did tremendous damage in terms of making people feel sorry for the South in the 1930s and stuff like that. The ideology in the Civil War is an important thing, okay? But it's one of these things that builds up over time, okay, from 61 to 65. The American Army is not on a big ideological campaign in the way that it was after Pearl Harbor. The American Army is not on a big ideological campaign the way it was, especially in 1917 when they go over to settle the First World War. That only comes in the second half of the war, and it is especially depressing for American historians, for Americans, especially for African Americans, the moral clarity brought about by the victory in the war is almost completely undone by the failure of Reconstruction and by the truly awful presidency Andrew Johnson. Lincoln is bracketed by two of the worst, if not the worst, presidents of all time. Buchanan, before the war, who does nothing to try to stop it or delay it or anything, and then Andrew Johnson, who just lets the South get away with literally murder. So I don't want to leave you with the idea that ideology. I want to leave you with the idea that the romanticism of the Civil War is completely misplaced. But I don't want to leave you with the idea that ideology and belief in the causes of the Civil War were not misplaced. And they were actually the belief, the moral belief that the Confederates have is obviously misplaced and immoral, but it was very, very strongly felt. And the ideology that the North had was very, very strongly felt and actually had impacts on the war as it went along. So I will leave it there, and the more details and stuff and pictures and all that sort of stuff in the recorded lecture, which I'll put up today. Any questions?
I don't have any.
Nope.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go try to repair the damage to my other class. By the way, I'm talking about the upper division class, not your class in the afternoon. It's an upper division class that I screwed up. So thanks, and I'll see you on Thursday.
See
Thanks. Have a good one.